The darkness that lurks in the shadows of true crime goes deeper than most people realize. While names like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer have become household horrors, there exists an entire underworld of killers whose crimes were so disturbing, so methodical, and so brutal that they've been deliberately buried in the archives of criminal history. These aren't the glamorized monsters of Hollywood films. These are the real predators who walked among us, smiled at their neighbors, and committed acts so unspeakable that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they uncovered. Today, we're diving into the twisted minds of 5 serial killers you've probably never heard of, but whose stories will haunt you long after you've finished listening. We're talking about Eileen Wuornos, the highway predator who turned America's truck stops into hunting grounds, the stoneman who terrorized an entire city with nothing but rocks and shadows, Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf who fed on blood and terror, the Honolulu strangler who brought nightmare to paradise, and Fritz Harman, the butcher who literally fed his victims to an unsuspecting public. These cases will show you just how thin the line is between civilization and chaos, between the person sitting next to you on the bus and the monster hiding behind their eyes. Each of these killers had their own signature, their own method, their own twisted logic that somehow made sense in their fractured minds. What's most disturbing isn't just what they did, but how long they got away with it, how many people they fooled, and how close they came to never being caught at all. We're starting with Eileen Wuornos, and her story begins not with murder, but with a childhood so brutal it reads like a blueprint for creating a killer. Born in Rochester, Michigan in 1956, Aileen Carol Pittman entered a world that seemed designed to destroy her from the very beginning. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a psychopathic child molester who was serving time in mental hospitals and prisons for crimes against children. He would later hang himself in his prison cell when Aileen was just 13 years old. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was barely 16 when Aileen was born, a teenage girl completely unprepared for the responsibility of raising a child, especially one born from such toxic genetics. But the nightmare was just beginning. When Aileen was 4 years old, her mother abandoned her and her brother Keith, dumping them on their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. What should have been a rescue became another layer of hell. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic with a violent temper who beat the children regularly. He didn't just discipline them, he brutalized them, using leather belts, switches, and his fists to teach lessons that had nothing to do with right and wrong and everything to do with power and control. The sexual abuse started early. Aileen would later claim that her grandfather began molesting her when she was just 6 years old, though she wouldn't speak about the full extent of the abuse until years later. She was also being sexually assaulted by her brother Keith, creating a toxic environment where violence and sex became intertwined in her developing mind. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen was trading sexual favors with neighborhood boys for cigarettes, food, and small amounts of money. She wasn't making a choice. She was surviving the only way she knew how in a world that had taught her that her body was the only thing she had of value. School offered no escape. Aileen was angry, volatile, and completely unable to connect with her peers or teachers. She got into fights constantly, both with other students and with authority figures. Her grades were terrible, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she couldn't focus on anything beyond the chaos of her home life. She was living in survival mode every single day, and education felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. By age 14, Aileen was pregnant. The father was allegedly a friend of her grandfather's, a grown man who had raped the teenage girl, though this was never officially confirmed or prosecuted. She was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a son who was immediately placed for adoption. She would never see the child again, and this abandonment would become another festering wound in her already damaged psyche. When she returned home after giving birth, things got even worse. Her grandmother Britta died of liver failure, leaving Aileen alone with her abusive grandfather. The beatings intensified, and Lori began throwing Aileen out of the house for days at a time, forcing her to sleep in the woods or in abandoned cars. She learned to fight, to steal, and to use her sexuality as both a weapon and a survival tool. By 15, she was living on the streets full-time, supporting herself through prostitution and petty theft. The streets of Michigan in the early 1970s were brutal for a teenage girl with no family, no education, and no legitimate way to earn money. Aileen quickly discovered that truck stops and highway rest areas were where she could find customers, men who were traveling through and wouldn't stick around long enough to cause problems. She learned to read people quickly, to spot the dangerous ones, and to always have an escape plan ready. But she also learned to hate. Every transaction, every encounter, reinforced her belief that all men were predators, that they saw her as nothing more than a piece of meat to be used and discarded. She was arrested multiple times throughout her teens and early 20s for prostitution, theft, assault, and disorderly conduct. She used multiple aliases, bounced between states, and developed a reputation among law enforcement as a troublemaker with a hair-trigger temper. But she wasn't a killer yet. That transformation was still years away, waiting for the right combination of desperation, rage, and opportunity to ignite the violence that had been building inside her since childhood. In 1976, when Aileen was 20 years old, she hitchhiked to Florida, drawn by the promise of year-round warm weather and busy highways full of potential customers. She settled into the world of highway prostitution, working the truck stops and rest areas along Interstate 75 and Interstate 4. She carried a gun for protection, a small pistol that she kept in her purse or tucked into her waistband. Every woman working the streets carried protection because the job was inherently dangerous and help was never coming if things went wrong. For years, Aileen worked the highways without killing anyone. She had her share of violent encounters, situations where customers tried to hurt her or refused to pay, but she handled these with threats, minor violence, or by simply running away. She was tough, street smart, and capable of taking care of herself, but she wasn't yet the predator she would become. That change required one more element, one more push that would transform her from a victim of circumstance into an active agent of death. The push came in the form of Tyria Moore, a woman Aileen met at a gay bar in Daytona Beach in 1986. Tyria, who went by Ty, was everything Aileen wasn't: soft-spoken, stable, and capable of showing genuine affection. For Aileen, who had never experienced real love or emotional connection, Ty represented something she had never dared to hope for, the possibility of a normal life. They moved in together, and for a brief period, Aileen tried to go straight, taking legitimate jobs and attempting to build the kind of relationship she had always craved. But legitimate work didn't pay enough to support both of them, and Aileen's lack of education and job skills made it nearly impossible to find steady employment. She kept returning to prostitution, telling herself it was temporary, just until they could get on their feet financially. Ty knew what Aileen was doing to support them, and while she claimed to disapprove, she didn't leave, and she didn't stop accepting the money that Aileen's work provided. This created a toxic dynamic where Aileen felt both guilty about what she was doing and resentful that she was carrying the entire financial burden of their relationship. The resentment festered, mixing with years of accumulated rage, trauma, and hatred toward the men who had used her throughout her life. Aileen began to see every customer not as an individual, but as a representative of every man who had ever hurt her, every man who had ever seen her as less than human. The last man to see Richard Mallory alive described him as nervous, jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder. It was November 30th, 1989, and Mallory had just left a Daytona Beach electronics repair shop where he'd been working late. He told a colleague he was meeting someone, maybe grabbing a drink, nothing unusual. By December 13th, his body was found in the woods near Ormond Beach, shot 3 times with a .22 caliber pistol. His car was missing, his wallet emptied, and investigators had no leads except for one detail that would haunt them for months. Multiple witnesses had seen him talking to a blonde woman at a roadside bar the night he disappeared. What they didn't know was that Richard Mallory had just become the first confirmed victim of Aileen Wuornos, and his death marked the beginning of a killing spree that would terrorize Florida's highways for over a year. But here's what makes this case so chilling. Aileen didn't hunt her victims in the traditional sense. She didn't stalk them or plan elaborate schemes. Instead, she waited. She positioned herself at truck stops, highway rest areas, and dive bars, places where desperate men went looking for company they couldn't find anywhere else. And when they approached her, when they offered money for her services, she saw something in their faces that triggered a rage so deep it had been building for decades. The transformation from victim to killer didn't happen overnight. After Tyria Moore left, Aileen's world collapsed completely. The one person who had made her feel human, who had given her hope for something resembling a normal life, was gone. And in that emptiness, something snapped. The men who picked her up stopped being customers and became symbols. Symbols of every man who had hurt her, used her, thrown her away like garbage. Her father who had abandoned her. Her grandfather who had beaten her. The Johns who had paid for her body but treated her like she was less than human. Richard Mallory made the mistake of being the wrong man at the wrong time. According to Aileen's later confessions, he had picked her up for sex, but when they reached a secluded area near the woods, something went wrong. She claimed he became violent, tried to assault her, and she shot him in self-defense. But investigators found details that didn't match her story. Mallory had been shot 3 times, execution style. His body showed no signs of a struggle. His wallet was methodically emptied, and his car was driven miles away before being abandoned. This wasn't self-defense. This was something else entirely. The kill gave Aileen something she had never experienced before: power. For the first time in her life, she was the one in control. She was the predator instead of the prey, and that feeling was intoxicating. Within weeks, she was back on the highways, back to the truck stops, but now she was hunting. She carried a gun, a small 22 caliber pistol that she kept hidden in her purse. The same type of weapon that would link her to victim after victim over the next 13 months. David Spears was next. A 43-year-old construction worker from Sarasota, he disappeared in June 1990 while driving to Orlando for a job interview. His body was found 6 days later in the woods near Citrus County, shot 6 times. His truck was discovered miles away, stripped of anything valuable. Like Mallory, Spears had been seen talking to a blonde woman at a truck stop the night before his disappearance. The pattern was becoming clear, but police still hadn't connected the dots. Then came Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker who vanished while driving from Missouri to Tampa. His body was found in Pasco County, shot 9 times with a 22 caliber pistol. His car was found abandoned, and witnesses reported seeing him with a blonde woman at a rest stop. The kills were becoming more brutal, more frenzied. Aileen was no longer just taking their money and leaving. She was unleashing years of pent-up rage on men who reminded her of everyone who had ever hurt her. What made Aileen so dangerous was her ability to blend in. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman down on her luck, desperate for money, willing to do whatever it took to survive. Men didn't see her as a threat. They saw her as vulnerable, easy to manipulate, someone they could use and discard. That perception made her the perfect predator. She could approach them, negotiate a price, get them alone, and strike before they realized what was happening. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, became her 4th confirmed victim in June 1990. He disappeared while driving from Arkansas to New Jersey to visit relatives. His body was never found, but his car was discovered abandoned in Orange Springs, Florida. This time, there were witnesses. 2 women had been seen driving the car erratically before crashing it and fleeing on foot. The description matched Aileen and her new girlfriend, a woman named Tyria Moore, who had returned to her life just as the killing spree intensified. But it was the 5th murder that finally gave police the break they needed. Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage salesman from Ocala, disappeared in July 1990. His body was found in the woods near Sumter County, shot twice with a 22 caliber pistol, but this time, Aileen made a mistake. She used Burris's credit card at several locations, creating a paper trail that led investigators directly to her. Store surveillance cameras captured her image, and suddenly the faceless killer had a name and a face. The final 2 victims came in quick succession. Charles Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired Air Force major, was found shot 7 times in September 1990. Walter Antonio, a 60-year-old trucker, was discovered shot 4 times in November 1990. Both men had been seen with a blonde woman before their disappearances. Both had been robbed after being killed, and both had been shot with the same 22 caliber pistol that linked all the murders together. By early 1991, the net was closing around Aileen Wuornos. Police had connected her to multiple crime scenes through witness testimony, credit card usage, and fingerprint evidence. They had surveillance footage, ballistics evidence, and a clear pattern of behavior. On January 9, 1991, she was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County on an outstanding warrant. She had no idea that investigators already suspected her of being Florida's first female serial killer. What happened next revealed the true depth of Aileen's transformation from victim to predator. During hours of interrogation, she showed no remorse, no emotion, no recognition that she had taken 7 lives. Instead, she was defiant, angry, convinced that she was the real victim. She claimed every killing was self-defense, that every man had tried to rape or assault her. But the evidence told a different story. These weren't panicked acts of self-preservation. They were calculated executions carried out by someone who had learned to see other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. The woman who had once been abandoned as a child, who had been beaten and abused and thrown away by society, had become the very thing she feared most. She had become the predator. And in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we create ourselves through neglect, through cruelty, through a system that fails the most vulnerable among us. Aileen Wuornos died by lethal injection in 2002, but her story lives on as a reminder that evil isn't born in a vacuum. The darkness that consumed Mumbai in the 1980s didn't come with a face or a name. It came with stones, silent, deadly, and methodical. Between 1985 and 1988, a shadow moved through the city's sleeping streets, targeting the most vulnerable members of society: the homeless, the destitute, those who had nowhere else to go but the cold pavement. He crushed their skulls with rocks as they slept, leaving behind a trail of terror that would grip one of the world's largest cities in paralyzing fear. They called him the Stone Man, and his reign of terror would claim at least 13 lives, though many believe the true number was far higher. What made him so terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his methods, but his ability to vanish into the night, leaving behind only shattered bones and a city that could no longer sleep peacefully. The first attack happened on a humid night in June 1985. A homeless man named Shankar Devi was found dead near the Sion railway station, his skull completely caved in. The weapon was a large stone, bloodied and discarded nearby. Police initially dismissed it as a random act of violence, perhaps a robbery gone wrong. After all, in a city of millions, where poverty and desperation ran deep, violence was nothing new. But there was something different about this killing, something that didn't fit the usual patterns of street crime. There was no struggle, no signs that the victim had even woken up. The killer had approached silently, struck with devastating precision, and disappeared without taking anything of value. The victim's few possessions, a torn blanket and a small pouch containing a few rupees, were left untouched. This wasn't about money. This was about something else entirely. 3 weeks later, another body was discovered. This time, it was a woman, found near the Matunga railway station. Her skull had been crushed with the same methodical precision as the first victim. Again, nothing was stolen. Again, there were no witnesses, no sounds of struggle, nothing to indicate who might have done this or why. The killer had struck while the victim slept, using a heavy stone to deliver a single, fatal blow. As the months passed, the attacks continued with horrifying regularity. Each victim was found in the same condition, their skulls shattered by heavy stones, their bodies left where they fell. The killer seemed to move through the city like a ghost, selecting his targets with cold calculation. He chose the forgotten people, those who lived on the margins of society, those whose deaths might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The victims were always alone, always asleep when attacked. They were rag pickers, beggars, mentally ill individuals who had nowhere else to go. The killer seemed to understand their routines, their vulnerabilities, their complete lack of protection. He would strike in the early hours of the morning, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the city was at its quietest and his victims were in their deepest sleep. What made the Stoneman so terrifying was his apparent invisibility. In a city where millions of people lived in close quarters, where privacy was a luxury few could afford, somehow this killer managed to move undetected. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no clues beyond the brutalized bodies and the bloodied stones. It was as if he materialized from the darkness, committed his horrific acts, and then dissolved back into the night. The police were baffled. They had no description of the killer, no witnesses, no physical evidence that could lead them to a suspect. The only thing they knew for certain was that someone was systematically hunting and killing the city's most vulnerable residents. The murders followed a clear pattern, but the killer himself remained completely anonymous. As news of the attacks spread, panic began to grip Mumbai's homeless population. The streets that had once provided shelter, however meager, now felt like hunting grounds. Homeless individuals began sleeping in groups, taking turns staying awake to watch for danger. Some abandoned their usual sleeping spots entirely, constantly moving to avoid becoming the next target. But the killer seemed to adapt to their changing behavior, always finding new victims who had let their guard down. The media began calling him the Stoneman, and the name stuck. Headlines screamed about the mysterious killer who was terrorizing the city's streets. The story captured the public imagination in a way that few crimes had before. Here was a killer who seemed almost supernatural in his ability to strike without being seen, to kill without leaving evidence, to vanish without a trace. But the Stoneman's reign of terror wasn't confined to Mumbai. As suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. For months, there were no more stone killings, no more crushed skulls found on the city's streets. Police wondered if the killer had died, been arrested for another crime, or simply moved on. The city began to breathe easier, hoping that the nightmare was finally over. Then, in 1988, the killings resumed, but this time, they weren't happening in Mumbai. They were occurring in Calcutta, over 1,000 miles away. The pattern was identical, the methodology unchanged. Homeless individuals were being found with their skulls crushed by stones, their bodies left where they fell. The killer had simply relocated, bringing his twisted campaign to a new city. The Calcutta killings were even more frequent than those in Mumbai. In just a few months, at least 12 people were murdered in the same brutal fashion. The killer seemed to have learned from his time in Mumbai, becoming even more efficient, even more elusive. He struck with the same precision, the same silence, the same complete absence of evidence. But unlike in Mumbai, the Calcutta police were ready for him. They had studied the Mumbai cases, understood the pattern, and were prepared to respond. They flooded the areas where homeless people gathered with plainclothes officers, set up surveillance, and coordinated with local communities to try to catch the killer in the act. The breakthrough came on a humid night in August 1988. A police constable named Rupin Roy was conducting a routine patrol when he noticed a man behaving suspiciously near a railway station. The man was carrying a large stone and appeared to be stalking a sleeping homeless person. When Roy approached, the man panicked and tried to flee. A chase ensued through the narrow streets of Calcutta, ending when the suspect was cornered in an alley. The man they arrested was Raman Raghav, a drifter who had been living on the streets for years. He was thin, disheveled, and appeared to be suffering from severe mental illness. When questioned, he initially denied any involvement in the killings, but as the interrogation continued, his story began to fall apart. He couldn't explain why he was carrying a stone, why he was stalking a sleeping person, why he had tried to run when approached by police. Under intense questioning, Raghav finally confessed, but his confession was rambling, incoherent, filled with references to voices in his head and divine commands. He claimed that he had been instructed to kill the homeless because they were impure, because they were a burden on society, because their deaths would somehow cleanse the world. His justifications were the product of a deeply disturbed mind, but his descriptions of the killings were chillingly accurate. Raghav described each murder in vivid detail, explaining how he would scout for victims, how he would select the perfect stone, how he would approach silently and strike with devastating force. He spoke about the killings with a disturbing lack of emotion, as if he were describing mundane daily tasks rather than brutal murders. There was no remorse, no recognition of the horror he had inflicted, just a cold recitation of facts. The investigation revealed that Raghav had been living rough for most of his adult life, drifting from city to city, surviving on whatever scraps he could find. He had a history of mental illness, had been in and out of psychiatric facilities, but had never received proper long-term treatment. He was intelligent enough to plan and execute his crimes, but delusional enough to believe they were justified. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of a man who had completely disconnected from humanity. He saw his victims not as people, but as objects, obstacles to be removed. He felt no empathy for their suffering, no connection to their humanity. To him, they were simply targets in a twisted game that only he understood. The trial was a media sensation. Raghav's bizarre behavior in court, his rambling statements about divine missions and cleansing rituals, his complete lack of remorse for his actions, all contributed to a public fascination with the case. Psychiatrists testified about his mental state, describing him as a paranoid schizophrenic who had lost touch with reality. But the evidence of his crimes was overwhelming, and the jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict. Raman Raghav was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was transferred to a high-security prison where he would spend the rest of his days. Even behind bars, he continued to exhibit the same disturbing behavior, talking to imaginary voices, claiming that his mission was not yet complete, insisting that he had been chosen for a higher purpose. But questions remained. Raghav had confessed to 25 murders across Mumbai and Calcutta, but police suspected the true number was higher. There were unsolved cases in other cities that bore his signature, homeless individuals found with their skulls crushed by stones, their bodies left where they fell. Raghav himself was unreliable, sometimes claiming responsibility for murders he couldn't have committed, other times denying involvement in killings that clearly bore his methodology. The Stoneman case exposed uncomfortable truths about Indian society. The victims were all from the most marginalized segments of the population, people who lived and died in the shadows of the country's major cities. Their deaths went largely unnoticed by the general public, their lives deemed unworthy of serious police investigation. It was only when the killings reached a certain threshold, when the pattern became undeniable, that authorities began to take notice. The case also highlighted the failures of the mental health system. Raghav had been identified as mentally ill years before his killing spree began, but he had never received adequate treatment. He had been released from psychiatric facilities multiple times, only to return to the streets where his condition deteriorated further. His crimes were the inevitable result of a system that failed to protect both him and his potential victims. In prison, Raghav became a subject of study for criminologists and psychiatrists. His case was analyzed in academic papers, his psychological profile dissected in textbooks. He represented a particular type of killer, one driven not by traditional motives like greed or passion, but by a delusional belief system that justified the most horrific acts of violence. Raghav died in prison in 1995, taking many of his secrets with him. He never provided a complete confession, never revealed the full extent of his crimes, never explained the twisted logic that had driven him to kill. His death marked the end of one of India's most notorious serial killing sprees, but it also left many questions unanswered. The Stoneman's legacy lives on in the memories of those who lived through his reign of terror. The homeless populations of Mumbai and Calcutta still speak of him in hushed tones, a reminder of how vulnerable they remained to those who would prey upon their desperation. Now let's step into the twisted world of Peter Kürten, the Dusseldorf vampire. Picture this: 1929, Germany. The streets of Dusseldorf were gripped by terror as children disappeared and bodies turned up with wounds so precise, so deliberate, that even seasoned detectives couldn't sleep at night. But what made this case different wasn't just the brutality, it was the calculated nature of it all. This wasn't some mindless beast hunting in the shadows. This was something far more chilling. A man who walked among ordinary people by day, polite and unremarkable, while planning his next victim by night. Peter Kürten was born in 1883 in Milheim am Rhein, a small industrial town near Cologne. From the very beginning, his life was soaked in violence. His father was a brutal alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children. But worse than the beatings was what young Peter witnessed in their cramped, squalid home. His father would force himself on his mother while the children watched, helpless and terrified. By age 9, Peter had seen things that would haunt most people for life. But instead of being traumatized, something inside him began to change. He started to feel excited by the violence, aroused by the power his father wielded over the family. The first sign of what Peter would become appeared when he was just 10 years old. He befriended the local dog catcher, a man who taught him how to torture and kill stray animals. Peter didn't just learn the techniques, he perfected them. He would spend hours in abandoned buildings, methodically cutting into dogs and cats while they were still alive, watching their eyes as the life drained out of them. The blood fascinated him. The control intoxicated him. He later described these moments as the most peaceful he'd ever felt, like everything in the world finally made sense. At 13, Peter committed his first murder. Two young boys were playing near the Rhine River when Peter approached them. He was older, stronger, and he offered to show them something interesting downstream. What happened next was swift and calculated. Peter pushed one boy into the water, then held him under while the second boy watched in horror. When the second boy tried to run, Peter caught him and drowned him too. Both bodies were found days later, but authorities assumed it was an accident. Two children playing too close to the dangerous currents. Peter walked away clean, but more importantly, he walked away changed. The rush of taking human life was unlike anything he'd experienced with animals. It was pure, absolute power. As Peter grew older, his crimes escalated. He started with arson, burning down barns and sheds just to watch the flames dance. But fire wasn't enough. He needed something more intimate, more personal. He began breaking into homes at night, not to steal, but to watch people sleep. He would stand over beds for hours, imagining what it would feel like to end their lives. Sometimes he would touch their faces, their necks, feeling for the pulse that he could stop with just a little pressure. The families never knew how close they came to death. In his 20s, Peter was arrested for a series of thefts and sentenced to prison. But prison didn't reform him, it refined him. He spent years thinking, planning, perfecting his methods. He studied anatomy books, learning exactly where to cut for maximum damage. He practiced on himself, making small incisions to understand how much pain the human body could endure. When he was finally released, Peter wasn't just dangerous anymore, he was lethal. He moved to Dusseldorf in 1925 and did something that chills investigators to this day. He got married. His wife, Auguste, was a widow who had no idea what kind of man she'd invited into her life. Peter played the role of devoted husband perfectly. He was gentle, considerate, even romantic. He brought her flowers, helped with household chores, and never raised his voice. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like that ideal couple. But at night, while Auguste slept peacefully beside him, Peter would slip out of their bed and prowl the streets like a predator. His first victim in Dusseldorf was 8-year-old Rosa Oliger. She was walking home from school when Peter offered her candy. Rosa was found hours later in a wooded area, her throat cut so deeply it had nearly severed her head. But that wasn't the worst part. Peter had positioned her body carefully, almost reverently, with her hands folded across her chest like she was sleeping. Nearby, investigators found something that made their blood run cold, a small puddle where someone had knelt in Rosa's blood as if drinking from it. The attacks continued with terrifying regularity. Peter didn't discriminate by age or gender. His victims ranged from young children to elderly women, from wealthy business owners to homeless drifters. What connected them all was the precision of their wounds and the strange, ritualistic way their bodies were arranged. Peter would cut them in specific patterns, almost like he was following some twisted blueprint only he could understand. Sometimes he used knives, sometimes scissors, occasionally just his bare hands. But always, there was blood. What made Peter truly terrifying wasn't just his violence, it was his patience. He would stalk potential victims for weeks, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He knew which route Maria Hahn took home from her job at the restaurant. He knew that little Gertrude Alberman played alone in the park every Tuesday afternoon. He knew that Herman Scheer walked his dog down the same dark street every night at exactly 10 o'clock. Peter turned murder into a science, and Dusseldorf was his laboratory. The city was paralyzed with fear. Parents wouldn't let their children outside after dark. Women traveled in groups, never alone. Men carried weapons and looked over their shoulders constantly. But Peter thrived on this terror. He would read the newspaper accounts of his crimes with the same satisfaction other people got from reading good reviews of their work. He even wrote anonymous letters to the police, taunting them with details only the killer could know. One letter described exactly how little Gertrude had begged for her life, how her voice had gotten quieter and quieter until it stopped altogether. But Peter's greatest skill wasn't killing, it was blending in. During the day, he worked at a factory where his co-workers described him as quiet but friendly. He never missed work, never caused trouble, never gave anyone reason to suspect he was anything other than an ordinary man trying to make a living. In the evenings, he would sit with Auguste in their small apartment, listening to the radio and discussing the terrible crimes that were plaguing their city. Augusta would express her horror at what kind of monster could do such things, and Peter would nod sympathetically, agreeing that the killer must be caught and punished. The investigation consumed the Dusseldorf Police Department. They interviewed thousands of suspects, followed hundreds of leads, and came up empty every time. Peter was always one step ahead, always careful, always invisible. He changed his methods regularly so investigators couldn't establish a clear pattern. Sometimes he would go months between attacks, letting the city relax just enough before striking again. Other times, he would kill multiple victims in a single week, sending the terror to new heights. Everything changed on May 14th, 1930. Peter approached a young woman named Maria Budlick at the train station. She was new to Dusseldorf, looking for work, and Peter offered to help her find lodging. They walked together through the quiet streets as Peter led her toward the Grafenberg Woods, the same area where he'd killed Rosa Oliger. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way Maria kept glancing around nervously, or maybe Peter was just overconfident after years of success. Whatever the reason, he made a mistake. When they reached an isolated path, Peter suddenly grabbed Maria and dragged her into the bushes. He pressed a knife to her throat and began to cut, but Maria fought back harder than any of his previous victims. She screamed, she clawed at his face, she refused to submit quietly like the others. In the struggle, Peter's knife slipped, cutting Maria but not fatally. Frustrated and worried that her screams might attract attention, Peter made a decision that would ultimately destroy him. He let her go. Maria survived, and more importantly, she remembered everything. She led police directly to the spot where Peter had attacked her. She described him in perfect detail, his height, his build, his voice, even the cologne he wore. For the first time in 5 years, investigators had a real lead. They canvassed the neighborhood, showing Maria's description to everyone they could find. Most people had never seen anyone matching that description, but one woman had. Augusta Kürten looked at the sketch and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The man in the drawing looked exactly like her husband. At first, Augusta tried to dismiss the similarity as coincidence. Peter couldn't be the Dusseldorf vampire. He was gentle, kind, incapable of hurting anyone. But the doubt gnawed at her. She started paying attention to things she'd ignored before, the way Peter would disappear for hours at night, claiming he couldn't sleep and needed to walk, the strange stains on his clothes that he said were from work, the newspaper clippings about the murders that he kept hidden in their bedroom. Slowly, horribly, the truth began to dawn on her. Auguste confronted Peter on May 24th, 1930. She didn't accuse him directly. She was too terrified for that. Instead, she asked him where he'd been on the night Maria Budlik was attacked. Peter looked at his wife for a long moment, and then he smiled. It wasn't the warm, loving smile she'd known for 5 years. It was something else entirely, something that made her blood freeze. Without saying a word, Peter began to confess. He told her about Rosa Oliger, about little Gertrude Alberman, about all the others. He described their final moments in vivid detail, how they'd looked at him with those wide, frightened eyes as he'd cut into them. Augusta listened in horror as the man she'd shared a bed with for 5 years revealed himself to be the monster that had terrorized their city. But Peter wasn't finished. He told her he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be something he wasn't. He was going to turn himself in, but first, he wanted her to know who she'd really been married to. He wanted her to understand that every night she'd slept peacefully beside him, she'd been inches away from death. The next morning, Auguste went to the police. Peter was arrested without resistance, almost as if he was relieved to finally be caught. In custody, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he seemed eager to talk. Over the course of several weeks, he confessed to 68 separate crimes, including 13 murders. He described each one in meticulous detail, drawing diagrams of wounds, explaining his methods, even demonstrating his techniques on mannequins. The investigators were simultaneously fascinated and horrified by his clinical approach to murder. During his trial, Peter showed no remorse whatsoever. He explained that he wasn't insane, wasn't driven by voices or delusions. He killed because he enjoyed it, because it gave him a satisfaction that nothing else in life could match. Peter Kürten was executed by guillotine on July the 2nd, 1931. Even facing death, he was still fascinated by blood, still curious about the mechanics of dying. He went to his execution with the same calm, scientific interest he'd shown throughout his killing spree. The case of Peter Kürten revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of evil. Here was a man who wasn't driven by trauma or mental illness in any traditional sense. He wasn't hearing voices, wasn't delusional, wasn't acting out of some misguided sense of justice. He was simply a human being who had discovered that he enjoyed causing pain and death, and who had decided to build his entire life around that enjoyment. He proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Our final case takes us across the Pacific to the bustling streets of Honolulu, where paradise met its darkest nightmare. Hawaii in the 1980s was a tourist destination where people came to escape their problems, to find peace under swaying palm trees and endless blue skies. But for 5 women, those same streets became hunting grounds for a predator who turned the island's promise of safety into a lie written in blood. The Honolulu Strangler wasn't a phantom or a mystery that took years to solve. He was hiding in plain sight, wearing the uniform of the very system meant to protect the innocent. His name was Howard Gay, and he was a Honolulu police officer. Howard Gay was born in 1943 in California, the son of a military family that moved frequently during his childhood. By all accounts, he was an unremarkable kid, quiet and studious, the type who blended into the background. His teachers described him as polite but distant, never causing trouble, but never really connecting with anyone either. That emotional distance would become his signature trait, a cold detachment that allowed him to compartmentalize his life in ways that most people couldn't imagine. After high school, Gay followed his father's footsteps into military service, joining the Army and serving a tour in Vietnam. Unlike many veterans who returned home changed by the war, Gay seemed to adapt to military life with unsettling ease. His commanding officers noted that he was efficient, followed orders without question, and never showed signs of stress or trauma. What they didn't realize was that Gay had found something in the structure of military life that suited him perfectly: the power to control others, the authority that came with the uniform, and the ability to operate within a system that rarely questioned its own. When Gay's military service ended, he drifted for a while, moving from job to job across the mainland United States. He worked as a security guard, a private investigator, and even spent time as a prison guard. Each job gave him a taste of authority, but none satisfied the growing hunger inside him. He needed more than just a uniform. He needed real power, the kind that came with a badge and a gun. In 1977, Gay applied to join the Honolulu Police Department. On paper, he was the ideal candidate: military service, law enforcement experience, clean record, and references who spoke of his professionalism and reliability. The department was expanding, trying to keep up with Hawaii's growing population and booming tourism industry. They needed experienced officers, and Gay seemed like exactly what they were looking for. What they didn't see was the darkness behind his professional facade. Gay had learned to wear masks, to project whatever image was expected of him. To his fellow officers, he was quiet but dependable, the type who would show up for his shift without complaint and handle whatever came his way. To his supervisors, he was efficient and thorough, someone who filed reports on time and never caused problems. To the community, he was just another cop, another face behind the badge. But at night, when his shift ended and he shed his uniform, Gay became something else entirely. He would cruise the streets of Honolulu in his personal car, sometimes using his police radio to monitor calls and avoid other officers. He knew the city better than almost anyone, knew where the vulnerable gathered, where the forgotten lived, where someone could disappear without immediate notice. His first victim was Vicki Gale Purdy, a 25-year-old woman who had come to Hawaii seeking a fresh start. Like so many others, she had been drawn by the promise of paradise, but life on the islands was harder than the postcards suggested. She was working as a waitress, struggling to make ends meet, living in a small apartment in one of Honolulu's less glamorous neighborhoods. On the night of June the 2nd, 1985, Vicki was walking home from work when she encountered Gay. What happened next would become his pattern. Gay would approach his victims in his police car, using his authority to gain their trust. He would tell them there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area, that it wasn't safe for them to be walking alone. He would offer them a ride, insisting it was for their own protection. Who would refuse a ride from a police officer? Who would question the very person they'd been taught to trust? Vicky got into Gay's car that night, believing she was being helped by someone sworn to protect her. Instead, she was being delivered to her death. Gay drove her to a remote area of the island, a place he had scouted during his patrols, where the sounds of the ocean would mask any screams. There, he strangled her with his bare hands, watching the life drain from her eyes with the same cold detachment he brought to everything else. But Gay didn't stop there. After killing Vicky, he violated her body, fulfilling fantasies that had been building inside him for years. Then he disposed of her remains with the methodical precision of someone who understood police procedure, who knew how investigations worked, who could anticipate what evidence would be looked for, and how to avoid leaving it behind. When Vicky's body was discovered 3 days later, the investigation was handled by Gay's own department. He volunteered to work the case, inserting himself into the investigation with the enthusiasm of someone eager to help solve a terrible crime. He interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and filed reports, all while knowing exactly what had happened because he had done it himself. The irony was sickening. The very system designed to catch killers was being manipulated by one of its own. Gay had access to all the evidence, all the theories, all the leads. He knew what the investigators were thinking, what direction they were heading, what suspects they were considering. He was like a chess player who could see both sides of the board, always staying one move ahead of the people trying to catch him. 3 months later, Gay struck again. His second victim was Regina Sakamoto, a 20-year-old college student who was walking home from a late-night study session at the University of Hawaii. Like Vicky, Regina trusted the police officer who offered her a ride, who told her it was dangerous to be out alone so late. Like Vicky, she died strangled in a remote location, her body violated and disposed of with clinical efficiency. The murders sent shockwaves through Honolulu's tight-knit community. 2 young women dead in similar circumstances, both strangled, both found in isolated areas. The media dubbed the killer the Honolulu Strangler, and fear began to spread through the city like a virus. Women changed their routines, avoided walking alone, looked over their shoulders constantly. The paradise that had once felt safe now felt menacing. The police department launched a massive investigation, bringing in detectives from other islands and even consulting with FBI profilers. They set up task forces, conducted hundreds of interviews, and followed every lead. And through it all, Howard Gay was right there with them, a dedicated officer working tirelessly to catch the monster who was terrorizing his community. Gay's third victim was Linda Pesce, a 36-year-old mother of 2 who was working as a hotel housekeeper to support her family. She was walking to her car after a late shift when Gay approached her in the hotel parking lot. This time, he told her there had been reports of break-ins in the area, that she should let him escort her to her vehicle for safety. Linda, exhausted from a long day of work and grateful for the protection, agreed. She never made it home. Her body was found 2 days later in the same remote area where Gay had disposed of his previous victims. The killer was establishing a pattern, becoming more confident, more brazen. He was taunting the police, challenging them to catch him, all while sitting in their briefing rooms and listening to their theories about who he might be. The investigation intensified after Linda's murder. The department brought in more resources, expanded the task force, and increased patrols throughout the city. They were looking for a serial killer, someone who understood police procedure, who could avoid detection, who might even have law enforcement training. The profile was eerily accurate, but no one wanted to believe that the killer might be one of their own. Gay's fourth victim was Denise Hughes, a 21-year-old tourist from California who had come to Hawaii for what was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime. She was staying at a hotel in Waikiki, exploring the island during the day and enjoying the nightlife after dark. On the night of March 15th, 1986, she was walking back to her hotel from a bar when Gay spotted her. This time, he told her there had been reports of attacks on tourists in the area, that it wasn't safe for her to be walking alone. He offered to drive her back to her hotel, presenting himself as a helpful local officer looking out for a visitor to his city. Denise, like the others, trusted the badge and the uniform. She got into his car believing she was being protected. Instead, she became the fourth victim of the Honolulu Strangler. Her body was found in the same remote location, strangled and violated like the others. But this time, Gay had made a mistake. In his confidence, in his belief that he was untouchable, he had left behind a piece of evidence that would eventually lead to his downfall. A partial fingerprint on Denise's purse, overlooked in the initial investigation, but discovered during a more thorough examination of the evidence. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it was enough. When the print was run through the department's database, it came back with a match that sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. The print belonged to Howard Gay. At first, investigators couldn't believe it. Gay was one of their own, a respected officer who had been working the case from the beginning. There had to be some mistake, some contamination of evidence, some innocent explanation. But as they dug deeper, the truth became undeniable. Gay had been at the scene of every murder, not as an investigator, but as the killer. He had inserted himself into the investigation to stay ahead of the evidence, to misdirect attention, to ensure that he would never be caught. He had used his position, his authority, his very uniform as weapons in his war against the innocent. The arrest came on a quiet Tuesday morning in May 1986. Gay was at his desk reviewing case files when his commanding officer approached him with a carefully neutral expression. He was told there were some questions about his whereabouts on certain nights, some inconsistencies in his reports that needed to be cleared up. Gay, still confident in his ability to manipulate the system, agreed to come in for questioning. He maintained his innocence, even as the evidence mounted against him. The fingerprint, the timeline of his shifts, the fact that he had been the first officer to volunteer for the task force, the way he had steered investigations away from promising leads. Everything pointed to his guilt, but Gay continued to deny everything, to present himself as a dedicated officer being railroaded by a department desperate to solve the case. But the evidence was overwhelming. During the search of his home, investigators found trophies from his victims, personal items he had taken as souvenirs. They found detailed notes about police procedure, about how investigations worked, about the best ways to dispose of evidence. They found a journal where Gay had written about his crimes, describing them not with remorse, but with clinical detachment, like a scientist documenting experiments. The trial was a sensation, covered by media from around the world. The idea that a police officer had been the Honolulu Strangler, that he had used his position to hunt and kill innocent women, shattered the community's faith in the very institution meant to protect them. Gay showed no emotion throughout the proceedings, sitting silently as victim after victim was described, as evidence was presented, as the full scope of his crimes was revealed. He was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even then, he maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy, that he had been framed by colleagues jealous of his success. He never showed remorse, never acknowledged the pain he had caused, never displayed any recognition that his victims were human beings whose lives had been cut short by his actions. Howard Gay died in prison in 2003, taking with him the full truth of his crimes. Investigators believe there may have been other victims, other women who encountered the helpful police officer who offered them rides to safety. But those cases remain unsolved, their victims' families left without answers, without justice, without closure. The Honolulu Strangler case changed how police departments across the country screen their officers, how they monitor their behavior, how they investigate crimes where one of their own might be involved. It shattered the illusion that the badge and uniform automatically confer moral authority, that those who wear them are somehow above the darkness that exists in every community. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries a badge, and presents itself as a protector. Sometimes the very people we trust to keep us safe are the ones we need to be protected from. And sometimes paradise itself can become a hunting ground for those who have learned to hide their true nature behind the masks that society expects them to wear. The women who died at the hands of Howard Gay trusted him because they had been taught to trust the uniform he wore. Fritz Harman's story reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature, about how society can overlook the most horrific crimes when they're happening right under its nose. Here was a man who butchered at least 24 young men and boys, sold their flesh as meat to unsuspecting customers, and dumped their remains in a river that supplied the city's water. Yet for years, he operated with impunity, protected by his status as a police informant and the chaos of post-war Germany. But Harman's case also exposes the dangerous intersection of authority and corruption. He wasn't just another criminal hiding in the shadows. He was embedded within the very system meant to protect society. Police knew him, worked with him, even relied on him for information. This gave him access, credibility, and most terrifyingly, victims. Young men fleeing poverty and desperation would approach him for help, seeing a well-dressed man with apparent connections to law enforcement. They trusted him because society had taught them to trust people like him. The psychological profile that emerges from Harman's crimes is equally chilling. Unlike many serial killers who operate from rage or sexual compulsion, Harman seemed to derive pleasure from the entire process: the hunting, the killing, the dismemberment, the disposal, even the act of selling human flesh to unknowing customers. It was all part of an elaborate game to him, a way of exercising complete control over life and death, while simultaneously mocking the society that had given him that power. What's perhaps most unsettling is how long it took for anyone to notice. Bodies were floating down the Lena River for years before authorities connected them to a single perpetrator. Missing persons reports were filed and forgotten. Families searched desperately for sons and brothers who had simply vanished. The police, meanwhile, continued working with Harmon, completely unaware that their informant was the very monster they should have been hunting. This pattern of institutional blindness appears throughout all 5 cases we've examined. Aileen Warnos's early cries for help were ignored by a system that saw her as disposable. The Stoneman's victims were society's most vulnerable, people whose deaths barely registered in official records. Peter Curtin operated for years in plain sight, his respectable facade hiding unspeakable cruelty. Howard Gay used his badge and authority to hunt the very people he'd sworn to protect, and Fritz Harmon turned law enforcement connections into a hunting license. Each of these killers succeeded not despite society's institutions, but because of them. They exploited gaps in the system, blind spots in our collective awareness, and the uncomfortable truth that some victims matter less than others. They understood that certain people, homeless individuals, sex workers, runaways, troubled youth, could disappear without generating the kind of attention that might expose them. The most disturbing realization is how many potential Fritz Harmons might be operating right now, hidden within systems of authority and trust. How many missing persons cases are actually connected to someone with credentials, someone with access, someone who knows exactly how investigations work because they're part of the system conducting them? How many unexplained disappearances might be explained if we looked more carefully at the people we least suspect? These cases force us to confront an uncomfortable reality about evil. It's not some external force that invades our communities like a natural disaster. It's something that grows from within, nurtured by neglect, enabled by corruption, and protected by our own unwillingness to look too closely at the people and institutions we depend on. The monsters aren't lurking in distant shadows. They're walking among us, wearing familiar faces, carrying credentials that grant them access to victims and credibility that shields them from suspicion. Fritz Harmon died nearly a century ago, but the conditions that created him persist. Vulnerable populations still exist. Authority figures still abuse their power. Society still has blind spots where predators can operate undetected. The names and faces change, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Somewhere, right now, another Harmon might be earning trust, gaining access, and preparing to exploit the very system meant to protect us all. The lesson isn't that we should trust no one or view every authority figure with suspicion. That would create a different kind of social breakdown. The lesson is that we must remain vigilant, especially toward those who seem above suspicion. We must listen to victims even when their stories seem impossible. We must investigate disappearances even when the missing are society's forgotten. And we must never assume that evil announces itself with obvious signs. From the shadows of Germany emerged a man whose very presence could empty entire city districts. Fritz Harmon didn't look like a monster when he walked the cobblestone streets of Hanover in the 1920s. Short, stocky, with a disarming smile and an almost grandfatherly demeanor, he seemed harmless enough. But behind that ordinary facade lurked something so twisted, so grotesque, that even today his name is whispered with a kind of horrified fascination. They called him the Butcher of Hanover, and for good reason. Between 1918 and 1924, at least 27 young men vanished from the streets of post war Germany. They weren't just murdered, they were butchered, processed, and sold as meat to unsuspecting customers throughout the city. And the man responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along, protected by the very system that should have stopped him. Fritz Heinrich Harman was born in 1879 into a world that seemed designed to break him. His father was a locomotive stoker, a hard man who saw weakness in his son's gentle nature and feminine mannerisms. From childhood, Fritz preferred dolls to toy soldiers, cooking to rough play. In an era when such behavior was not just discouraged, but violently suppressed, Fritz learned early that being different meant being dangerous. The beatings started young. His father would drag him into the cellar and whip him with leather straps, trying to beat the softness out of him. His mother, overwhelmed and powerless, could only watch as her son retreated further into himself. By his teens, Fritz was already showing signs of the darkness that would later consume him. He tortured small animals, set fires, and displayed an unsettling fascination with death and decay. At 17, Fritz was committed to a mental asylum after attempting to molest several children. The doctors described him as morally defective, sexually deviant, and potentially dangerous. But this was 1896, and psychiatric care was primitive at best. After 6 months, he was released with no treatment, no supervision, and no hope of rehabilitation. Society had labeled him a monster and then set him loose to become one. What happened next would haunt Germany for decades. Fritz drifted through various jobs, always struggling, always on the margins. He served briefly in the military, but was discharged for health reasons. He tried his hand at different trades, but could never hold steady employment. And all the while, something inside him was growing darker, hungrier. The turning point came during World War I. As Germany bled itself white in the trenches, the home front descended into chaos. Food was scarce, order was breaking down, and in that atmosphere of desperation, Fritz Harman found his calling. He became a police informant, trading information about black market activities and deserters in exchange for protection and a steady income. This arrangement gave Fritz something he had never possessed before: power, and he used that power in the most horrific ways imaginable. Operating out of a cramped apartment near Hanover's main railway station, Fritz would prowl the platforms looking for victims. Young men, often runaways or deserters, desperate and alone. He would approach them with kindness, offering food, shelter, work. They trusted him because he seemed safe, ordinary, even fatherly. But once they followed him home, they entered a nightmare from which they would never emerge. Fritz would feed them, gain their trust, and then when they were at their most vulnerable, he would strike. His preferred method was strangulation, but not with his hands or a rope. Fritz would bite through his victims' throats, tearing out their windpipes with his teeth like a rabid animal. The sexual component of these murders was as disturbing as it was consistent. Fritz was a predator in every sense of the word. But the killing was only the beginning. What Fritz did next elevated him from mere serial killer to something far more monstrous. He would butcher the bodies with the skill of a professional meat cutter, which he had once been. Arms, legs, torso, everything was carefully processed and prepared. Some parts he would keep for himself, cooking and eating them in elaborate meals. Others he would sell to local restaurants and meat markets, mixed in with pork and beef to disguise the taste. For years, the people of Hanover unknowingly consumed human flesh sold by Fritz Harman. Restaurants served it to their customers. Families fed it to their children. The horror of this revelation, when it finally came to light, would traumatize the city for generations. Fritz had turned an entire population into unwitting cannibals. His partnership with Hans Granz, a young man who became both lover and accomplice, added another layer of depravity to the operation. Granz would help Fritz lure victims, dispose of evidence, and sell the meat. Together, they created a factory of death in the heart of one of Germany's major cities, operating with impunity for over 6 years. The end came in 1924, not through brilliant detective work, but through pure chance. Children playing by the river line began finding human skulls and bones washing up on the shore. At first, authorities assumed they were ancient remains, perhaps from some long-forgotten cemetery. But as more and more body parts surfaced, it became clear that something far more sinister was at work. The investigation that followed revealed a horror beyond imagination. Fritz's apartment was a charnel house, stained with blood and reeking of death. Clothing from dozens of victims was found carefully stored in his wardrobes. Personal effects, identification papers, and jewelry filled every drawer and closet. Most damning of all, investigators found evidence of the meat processing operation, including tools, packaging materials, and customer lists. When confronted with the evidence, Fritz didn't deny his crimes. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally tell his story. He confessed to 27 murders, though investigators suspected the true number was much higher. Some estimates put his victim count at over 50 young men, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in German history. During his trial, Fritz displayed a chilling lack of remorse. He described his crimes in vivid detail, explaining his methods with the dispassionate tone of a craftsman discussing his trade. He showed no understanding of the horror he had inflicted, no recognition of his victims' humanity. To him, they had been nothing more than raw material for his twisted appetites. The courtroom was packed day after day as Germans struggled to comprehend the magnitude of Fritz's crimes. Here was a man who had operated in their midst for years, protected by the police, trusted by his neighbors, welcomed into their community. The revelation that he had been feeding them human flesh added a layer of revulsion that transcended normal criminal behavior. Fritz Harman was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine on April 15, 1925. His last words were reportedly a complaint about the incompetence of the executioner. Even facing death, he remained utterly devoid of remorse or human feeling. But Fritz's story didn't end with his execution. In the years that followed, investigators continued to uncover evidence of his crimes. More bodies were found, more victims identified. The full scope of his operation may never be known, but what is certain is that Fritz Harman represents one of the darkest chapters in German criminal history. What makes Fritz's case so disturbing isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the systematic way he was able to operate. His position as a police informant gave him protection and legitimacy. His meat-selling business provided the perfect cover for disposing of evidence, and his ordinary appearance allowed him to move through society without suspicion. Fritz Harman proved that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who look like everyone else, who smile and shake hands and gain your trust before revealing their true nature. He showed that evil can wear a friendly face, and that the systems we trust to protect us can sometimes shield the very predators we fear most. In post war Germany, as the nation struggled to rebuild and make sense of the carnage that had consumed Europe, Fritz Haarmann emerged as a symbol of something deeper and more troubling than simple criminality. He represented the complete breakdown of moral order, the transformation of a human being into something beyond recognition or redemption. The case of Fritz Haarmann reminds us that evil isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and methodical. Sometimes it lives next door, works at the corner shop, or helps the police solve crimes. Our final chapter brings us face to face with perhaps the most unsettling truth about these monsters. They existed not in some distant realm of evil, but right here among us, hidden behind masks of normalcy that society failed to see through. What makes these 5 killers so profoundly disturbing isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the systematic failures that allowed them to operate for so long. Aileen Wuornos was a broken woman, failed by every institution meant to protect children. The system that should have saved her instead created a predator who turned her pain outward onto innocent victims. She wasn't born a killer. She was forged into one by neglect, abuse, and abandonment. The Stoneman case reveals something even more chilling about societal indifference. In Mumbai, a city of millions, a man could crush the skulls of sleeping victims night after night while authorities remained baffled. Raman Raghav wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was a mentally ill man whose delusions drove him to kill. But the real horror lies in how easily the most vulnerable members of society, the homeless and forgotten, became his targets. Their deaths barely registered because their lives barely mattered to those in power. Peter Curtin represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. He was a respected member of his community, a man who could charm his way into anyone's confidence. His ability to maintain this facade while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty shows us how monsters don't always look like monsters. They smile, they shake hands, they live next door, and they feed their neighbors human flesh without blinking an eye. But perhaps the most terrifying revelation comes from Howard Gay, the Honolulu Strangler. Here was a police officer, someone sworn to serve and protect, who used his badge as a hunting license. He didn't just kill women, he manipulated entire investigations to cover his tracks. The very institution meant to catch killers was harboring one. How many times did he stand over crime scenes he created, offering comfort to families he had destroyed, all while planning his next attack? And then there's Fritz Haarmann, the butcher who turned murder into a business model. For years, he operated with the protection of corrupt officials, selling human flesh to unsuspecting customers while police looked the other way. His case exposes not just individual evil, but institutional rot that allowed that evil to flourish. The people who should have stopped him instead enabled him, turning justice into a commodity that could be bought and sold. These aren't just stories about individual monsters, they're indictments of the systems that failed to stop them. Each case reveals cracks in the foundation of civilized society, spaces where predators could hide and hunt while authorities remained willfully blind. The homeless victims of the Stonemen, The runaway teenagers targeted by Warnos, the women stalked by Gay, they all shared one tragic similarity. They existed on the margins of society where their disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. What's most unsettling is how these killers strayed in plain sight. Curtin attended his own trial as a spectator before anyone suspected him. Gay investigated his own crimes. Harmon sold his victims' flesh at the local market. They weren't operating from remote cabins or hidden lairs. They were embedded in their communities, protected by assumptions about what evil looks like. The psychological profiles that emerge from these cases paint a disturbing picture of how monsters are made. Childhood trauma, societal neglect, institutional failure, and individual choice all combined in toxic ways. But understanding these factors doesn't excuse their actions. It reveals how preventable much of this horror could have been if society had intervened earlier, if systems had functioned properly, if warning signs hadn't been ignored. Perhaps the most chilling realization is that for every monster we've discussed tonight, there are others still operating, still hidden, still hunting. The same systemic failures that enabled these killers continue to exist today. The same vulnerable populations remain at risk. The same institutional blind spots persist. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and societal structure. They show us that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it wears a uniform, sometimes it offers help, sometimes it smiles and makes pleasant conversation while planning unspeakable acts. The victims of these monsters deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in criminal files, but as human beings whose lives were cut short by a combination of individual evil and systemic failure. Their deaths reveal gaps in our social safety net that remain unrepaired, vulnerabilities that continue to be exploited by those who understand how to hide in plain sight. As we close this examination of forgotten evil, we're left with disturbing questions that have no easy answers. How many more monsters are out there, protected by institutional corruption or societal indifference? How many vulnerable people are at risk right now because we've failed to learn the lessons these cases should have taught us? The most frightening truth about these killers isn't that they existed, it's that the conditions that created and enabled them still exist today. The homeless still sleep unprotected on city streets. Children still fall through cracks in overwhelmed systems. Authority figures still abuse their power, and society still looks away when it's convenient to do so. These 5 killers may be dead or imprisoned, but their legacy lives on in every system that fails to protect the vulnerable, every institution that prioritizes image over justice, and every society that chooses willful blindness over difficult truths. They remind us that monsters aren't mythical creatures from distant nightmares. They're products of our own failures, walking among us, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The darkness they represent isn't some external force we can simply defeat and forget. It's a reflection of the darkness within human nature and human systems, a shadow that follows civilization wherever it goes. Understanding these monsters isn't just about satisfying morbid curiosity. It's about recognizing the warning signs, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that the conditions that created these killers never have the chance to create others. In the end, these forgotten monsters teach us that evil thrives not in dramatic confrontations between good and evil, but in quiet moments when good people choose to look away, when systems choose convenience over justice, and when society chooses comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. As we reach the end of our journey through these dark chapters of human history, we're left with a haunting question that echoes through time. What creates a monster? What transforms a human being into something so far removed from empathy, so disconnected from the basic fabric of humanity that murder becomes routine, that cruelty becomes currency, that death becomes art? The five killers we've explored today, Eileen Wuornos, the Stoneman, Peter Curtin, Howard Gay, and Fritz Harman, weren't born monsters. They were children once, breathing the same air, walking the same earth, harboring the same potential for good and evil that exists within all of us. But somewhere along the way, something broke, something fundamental shifted, and the line between civilization and savagery disappeared entirely. What's most disturbing isn't just what they did, but how easily they moved through society undetected. Aileen Wuornos spent years on highways, hitchhiking with truckers, living in motels, existing in plain sight while bodies piled up behind her. The Stoneman melted into the crowds of Mumbai, just another face among millions, using the city's own indifference as camouflage. Peter Curtin walked the streets of Dusseldorf like any other citizen, polite, well-dressed, unremarkable. Howard Gay wore a badge, carried the authority of law enforcement, used his position to hunt. Fritz Harman operated from within the system itself, selling human flesh while authorities looked the other way. These weren't shadowy figures lurking in abandoned buildings or hiding in remote forests. They were embedded in the very fabric of society, using our trust, our systems, our vulnerabilities against us. They understood that the best place to hide a monster is in plain sight, behind a smile, behind a uniform, behind a mask of normalcy that we're conditioned to accept without question. The victims they chose tell us something equally disturbing about how society values human life. Prostitutes, the homeless, runaways, the mentally ill, the marginalized, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger investigations, whose deaths wouldn't make headlines, whose lives were deemed somehow less valuable by the world around them. These killers didn't just prey on the vulnerable, they exploited our collective indifference to vulnerability. But perhaps what's most chilling is how institutional failure enabled their crimes. Police departments that didn't take missing persons reports seriously, social services that failed to protect children, mental health systems that released dangerous individuals back into society, corruption that allowed killers to operate with impunity. These weren't just individual failures of character, they were systemic breakdowns that created hunting grounds for predators. The Stoneman operated in a city where the homeless were already dying from poverty, disease, and neglect. A few more bodies barely registered. Peter Curtin thrived in a society emerging from the chaos of World War I, where violence had become normalized, where authorities were overwhelmed. Howard Gay used his position in law enforcement to access victims and cover his tracks, knowing that his badge provided both opportunity and protection. Fritz Harman operated during a period of social and economic upheaval when desperation made people willing to overlook suspicious behavior in exchange for food or shelter. These killers didn't just exploit individual victims, they exploited entire society's blind spots, their prejudices, their willingness to look the other way when the victims were people they'd already written off. They understood that monsters aren't created in isolation. They're enabled by systems, by cultures, by the collective decisions we make about who matters and who doesn't. The geographic spread of these crimes tells another story. From the highways of Florida to the streets of Mumbai, from the neighborhoods of Dusseldorf to the beaches of Honolulu, from the back alleys of Hanover, evil doesn't respect borders, cultures, or time periods. It adapts, it evolves, it finds new ways to manifest itself wherever conditions allow it to flourish. What's particularly disturbing is how these killers viewed their victims. To Aileen Wuornos, the men she killed weren't individuals with families, dreams, fears. They were symbols of every man who had ever hurt her. To the Stoneman, the homeless weren't people deserving of compassion. They were obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved with violence. To Peter Curtin, his victims were objects for his twisted gratification, their humanity irrelevant to his needs. To Howard Gay, the women he killed were disposable, their lives worth less than his momentary pleasure. To Fritz Harman, young men weren't people, they were literally meat to be consumed and sold. This dehumanization is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their psychology. They didn't see murder as the taking of a human life. They saw it as the removal of an obstacle, the satisfaction of a need, the expression of power. They had crossed a line that most of us can't even imagine approaching, where other human beings become objects, where suffering becomes entertainment, where death becomes routine. The investigation and capture of these killers reveals both the best and worst of human nature. Dedicated investigators who refused to give up, who saw patterns where others saw random violence, who fought against bureaucracy and indifference to bring killers to justice, but also the failures, the missed opportunities, the times when prejudice and incompetence allowed killers to continue their sprees long after they should have been stopped. The media coverage of these cases reflects society's complex relationship with evil. We're simultaneously fascinated and repulsed, drawn to understand what we fear most. But there's a danger in that fascination. In focusing too much on the killers themselves, we risk losing sight of their victims, of the real human cost of their actions, of the systemic failures that enabled their crimes. The psychology of these killers defies simple explanations. Childhood trauma, mental illness, social isolation, substance abuse, these factors appear again and again, but they don't excuse the choices these individuals made. Millions of people experience trauma without becoming killers. The vast majority of people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Something else was at work here, something that transformed pain into cruelty, isolation into predation, suffering into a weapon used against others. The legacy of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families destroyed, communities traumatized, trust shattered. The ripple effects continue for generations, creating new cycles of fear, suspicion, and pain. The prostitutes who became more careful, more isolated. The homeless who learned to sleep with one eye open. The citizens who stopped trusting their neighbors, their police, their institutions. These cases remind us that evil isn't an abstract concept. It's a real force that manifests itself through human actions, through choices made by individuals who could have chosen differently. It's not supernatural, not mythical, not something that exists outside our understanding. It's human, terrifyingly human, and that's what makes it so dangerous. The most sobering realization is how easily any of us could have been victims. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong person offering help or asking for directions. These killers didn't choose their victims based on any grand design. They chose them based on opportunity, vulnerability, convenience. Their victims were people like us, with hopes and fears, families and friends, lives that mattered just as much as our own. In the end, these stories serve as a warning, a reminder that the veneer of civilization is thinner than we'd like to believe. That monsters walk among us, hidden behind familiar faces, using our own humanity against us. That the price of safety is vigilance, not just individual awareness, but collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to demand accountability from our institutions, to refuse to accept that some lives matter less than others. The darkness we've explored today isn't just about the past, it's about the present, about the future, about the ongoing struggle between our capacity for good and our potential for evil. These killers remind us that evil is not some distant, abstract force. It's a choice made by individuals who could have chosen differently, enabled by systems that could have done better, allowed to flourish in societies that could have cared more. The question isn't whether monsters exist. We've proven that they do. The question is what we do with that knowledge, how we use it to build better systems, stronger communities, more compassionate societies. The question is whether we learn from these dark chapters or allow them to repeat, whether we honor the victims by preventing future tragedies or forget them in our rush to move on. In remembering these stories, we remember not just the killers, but their victims, not just the darkness, but our responsibility to shine light into it. We remember that evil triumphs when good people do nothing, when systems fail, when society looks the other way. And we remember that the best defense against monsters isn't walls or weapons. It's humanity itself, our capacity to care for each other, to protect the vulnerable, to refuse to accept that some lives don't matter. The monsters we've explored today are gone, but the conditions that created them remain. These stories reveal a disturbing truth about our society. Evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or warning signs. It doesn't wear a mask or lurk in obvious shadows. Instead, it walks among us, quiet and patient, hiding behind smiles and normalcy. Each of these killers succeeded not because they were supernatural monsters, but because they understood how to exploit the fundamental weaknesses in our systems and our humanity. Aileen Wuornos operated on highways where women like her were invisible to society. The Stoneman struck in a city where the homeless were treated as disposable. Peter Curtin thrived in a community that refused to see the darkness growing in their midst. Howard Gay used his authority as a mask while targeting those society deemed less worthy of protection. Fritz Harman turned an entire neighborhood into his hunting ground, with neighbors who chose not to ask uncomfortable questions. What connects all these cases isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the systematic failures that enabled them. Police departments that didn't communicate with each other, social services that abandoned the vulnerable, communities that turned away from inconvenient truths, media that ignored victims who didn't fit their narrative of who deserved attention. Each killer found the cracks in our collective conscience and exploited them ruthlessly. The most chilling aspect of these stories isn't the violence itself, but how predictable the patterns were. Society's most vulnerable members, homeless individuals, sex workers, children from broken homes, people struggling with mental illness, immigrants trying to survive, were the preferred victims. Not because they were easier targets, though they often were, but because their disappearances caused fewer ripples. Their deaths generated less outrage. Their stories were less likely to make headlines. This isn't ancient history. These same blind spots exist today. We still have populations that exist on the margins, people whose lives are deemed less valuable by the systems meant to protect them. We still have authorities who dismiss cases too quickly when the victims don't fit a certain profile. We still have communities that choose willful ignorance over uncomfortable action. The psychology behind these crimes reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. Each killer was shaped by trauma, abandonment, and systematic failures in their early lives. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it exposes the cyclical nature of violence and neglect. Children who are discarded by society sometimes grow up to discard others. People who are dehumanized sometimes learn to dehumanize others in return. But perhaps the most important lesson from these cases is that evil is often enabled by ordinary people making ordinary choices. The neighbors who heard screams but didn't call police. The officials who dismissed reports because they came from undesirable sources. The communities that were content to let certain problems exist as long as they stayed in certain neighborhoods. The journalists who decided some stories weren't worth telling. These killers weren't caught by heroes or brilliant detectives. They were caught when ordinary people finally decided to act. A witness who overcame fear to come forward. A police officer who refused to dismiss another case. A community member who decided that all lives had value. A journalist who insisted that every victim deserved a story. The real horror of these cases isn't that monsters exist, it's that they exist because we allow them to. Every unchecked missing person report, every dismissed witness, every victim deemed unworthy of full investigation creates space for predators to operate. Every time we look away from society's most vulnerable members, we create hunting grounds for those who prey on the forgotten. Understanding these cases isn't about satisfying morbid curiosity. It's about recognizing the patterns that allow such predators to flourish. It's about understanding that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we'd like to believe, and that maintaining that line requires constant vigilance from all of us. These killers succeeded because they understood something we often forget, that evil thrives in the spaces where society stops caring. They found the people no one would miss, the places no one wanted to look, the stories no one wanted to hear. They turned our collective indifference into their greatest weapon. The legacy of these cases should be a commitment to leaving no one behind, to ensuring that every missing person is searched for with equal urgency, that every victim is mourned with equal dignity, that every community member is protected with equal determination. Because the moment we decide that some lives matter less than others, we create the conditions where monsters can thrive. These stories remind us that the greatest evil isn't committed by obvious villains, but by ordinary people who choose to look away when they should act, who choose silence when they should speak, who choose indifference when they should care. The real battle against evil isn't fought with weapons or laws alone, but with the daily choice to see the humanity in everyone, especially those society would prefer to forget. In the end, these cases teach us that we are all connected. Society that abandons its most vulnerable members creates the conditions for their exploitation. The communities that refuse to see uncomfortable truths become complicit in unspeakable crimes. The individuals who choose indifference over action bear responsibility for the consequences of that choice. The monsters in these stories are dead or imprisoned, but the systems that enabled them remain. The question isn't whether evil exists, but whether we have the courage to confront it, not just in its most obvious forms, but in the subtle ways we allow it to take root in our indifference, our prejudices, and our willingness to look away from inconvenient truths. That's the real lesson of these forgotten killers. They weren't supernatural, they weren't unstoppable. They were enabled by ordinary failures of human decency, and they can be prevented by ordinary acts of human courage. The choice, as always, is ours.